Welcome everyone to Virtual Insights, Marvels of My Own Inventiveness. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Mathilde Walker-Billo. I'm curator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum. And I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As many of you know, EFAM is dedicated to the work of self-taught artists across time and place. Second slide, please. And we are thrilled to offer a new perspective on the museum's collection with the exhibition Marvels of My Own Inventiveness, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until March 24th, along with a concurrent exhibition unnamed figures, Black presence and absence in the early American North. Featuring contemporary paintings on paper, canvas, wood, and metal, both large-scale and intimate, this show explores the artistic self-expression of 5 Black makers working in and around abstraction: Leonard Daley, Claude Lawrence, J.B. Murray, Mary T. Smith, and Purvis Young. After Material Witness, Folk and Self-Taught Artists at Work, this exhibition is the second in a series of thematic shows drawn from the museum's collection, organized in the Daniel Cowin Gallery and generously supported by a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. This series of exhibitions invites us to admire the museum's collection up close while showcasing an expansive history of American art. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by the curator of this exhibition, Brooke Wyatt, Luce assistant curator at EFAM, and Sadé Ayorinde, a Terra Foundation pre-doctoral fellow in American art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, who recently served as Warren Family Assistant Curator at EFAM. So today the curators will walk us through the immersive setting of the exhibition, which prioritizes contemplation. This curatorial walkthrough will last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a short conversation. There will be time for Q&A, so please share your questions for speakers throughout the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll be using the chat room to share more details about our speakers and also about the program. So if you need any information, drop me a line in the chat. And before I turn it over to Brooke and Sadé, please know that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. We're grateful for opportunities like this program to connect online, which will not be possible without you. Thank you. I hope you will consider supporting our program through a donation to the museum. Following this conversation, your support has great impacts and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk artists and self-taught artists. And now I'll hand it over to our speakers. Please welcome them both. Hi there.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us. We wanted to start today off a little bit differently by doing a close looking activity. So we wanted to spend some time with this work here. So I'm going to go ahead and just let you look at this for about 30 seconds, and then I'll run through a series of questions that might help with your exploration. And so, as I run through these questions that we hope will sort of stir some thoughts in you about this work, we would love to have you respond. So, if you're with someone, you can tell the person next to you what you're thinking, you can write something down. We would also really love to have you respond in the chat so that we can see what you're thinking and maybe we can talk about a few of the answers at the end. So, looking at this work, what first catches your eye? And if you were asked to describe this work to someone who couldn't see it, what aspects would you focus on and what associations might you make? Which of your senses does this work engage? Are you experiencing any emotional or physical sensations or reactions? What colors do you notice? Does the painting have a sense of movement? If so, how would you describe it? Is it fast or slow? Is it choreographed or completely freeform? And in this particular question, if you feel so moved, you could pretend that maybe you're making this work or copying this work and think about what kinds of movements that your hand would make. If this painting was a place and you were there, where would you be? And then lastly, if you could talk to the artist who made this, what would you ask them? So we've been looking at one of the objects that's included in our show, this untitled work by the artist J.B. Murray. So I definitely want to see some of the things people are saying. Brooke, can you see some of the things people are saying?
Yeah, it's really fun and fascinating to watch this chat conversation evolve.
So aliens and tiny creatures, yes, I definitely get that. Some sort of tiny creature that looks like there's a sort of smattering of eyeballs that might be looking out at us. Ghosts, that this has a lot of depth with this, which is really interesting. Um, the
And
brushstrokes and textures first catch my eye. Yes, definitely.
I noticed somebody suggested ghosts
Oh yeah.
question. And I was like, yeah, of course. I like looking again for the first time. I was in a little more of a everyday space. I was looking at the bottom right hand corner and thinking ketchup and mustard.
Oh yeah. I've considered that too, like the red and the yellow at the bottom, right?
Condiments.
Condiments. Slight touch or sight and touch. It seems tactical. I like that. Somebody's curious when looking at these marks. Um, that it's swirling, that it's fast and going in lots of different directions. I definitely get a lot of movement. For me, it's like busiest in the blue section in the upper left. That's where I get the most movement. that some shapes look like figures. Absolutely. Someone's along a river, others are in a city. That's cool. Yeah, definitely. Depending on what city you're in, it could seem like you're being kind of swallowed by the mass of these. Thank you, everyone, for adding your comments. It's really delightful to see what you're thinking, and really helpful for the purposes of this presentation. So thank you for doing that, for humoring us.
Just noticed Lori has noted a close-up of textile or close-up of a knitted or crocheted piece. And that's a really interesting way of looking at this painting on paper.
I agree, yeah. And something I haven't thought of before.
Yeah, the experience of close looking, it's not supposed to be there yet. The experience of close looking that we've just gone through together is at the heart of this show. With Marvels, we bring the artworks themselves to the forefront as a means of highlighting the artist's inventiveness and personal expression. We wanted to investigate how artists are present through the artworks that they've made. In other words, how the creative process can be observed in every mark or brushstroke, which in turn represents an accumulation of insights, knowledge, and decision-making on the part of the artist. Here you can see a photo of the painting by J.B. Murray that we just looked at, as it is currently installed in the exhibition in a tabletop case. Starting with close looking to generate a series of questions, as we just did, is akin to how Sadé and I approached every artwork in this show. To accompany Murray's work, we compiled some questions that we had for the artist in the form of a letter, which appears inside of the table case, and which I will read now. Dear J.B. Murray, we enjoy being surrounded by your work. That is, the experience of getting lost in the play of colors, the brushwork, the scrolling, the handwritten script, and the network of dots. We wanted to ask you about your paintings on paper in this exhibition. Did you make them as works of art, as sources of protection, as spiritual meditations, or as something else entirely? Did you perhaps make them as all of these things at once? Your mark making accumulates and builds up, and it seems to contain a great mass while at the same time acting as an ephemeral veil or shield. How can we respect the multiplicity present in your work? How it operates as art, but also as a passageway, as something unnameable, or that is simultaneously inviting yet impenetrable? With gratitude, Brooke, Wyatt, and Sadé, Ayorinde. Here you can see a view of the exhibition with our title, Marvels of My Own Inventiveness. Our presentation today will give you some insights into our collaborative curatorial journey as it evolved over time, and will introduce you to key elements we focused on to highlight the expressive creativity of each artist in the exhibition.
In order for me to speak a truer word concerning myself, I must strip down through layers of attenuated meaning, made an excess in time, over time, assigned by a particular historical order, and there await whatever marvels of my own inventiveness. So wrote the literary critic and Black feminist scholar Hortense J. Spillers in 1987, contending that true self-expression and creativity can only be realized by rejecting the forces that limit the agency and subjectivity of Black people. Far too often, expectations about materials, form, and subject matter have defined the interpretation of the artistic production of Black self-taught artists, and anecdotal accounts of artists' lives have long overshadowed sustained visual analysis of these formally complex works. Among the ideas limiting the wholesale appreciation of these artworks is that they be figurative rather than abstract or conceptual, and that they convey a recognizable narrative or clear social message rather than a story told primarily through color and line, and that they fit within established folk art categories and vernacular traditions.
To push back against what we identify as a historical imbalance, Our exhibition foregrounds the formal and experiential qualities of works by 5 Black painters in AFAM's collection: Mary T. Smith, Claude Lawrence, J.B. Murray, Leonard Daley, and Purvis Young. Rather than relying on biographical or regional context to structure our intervention, we ground our exploration in the artworks themselves. The artists we selected all work in and between abstraction and figuration, meaning that their work lies at various points across a spectrum between using recognizable or representational imagery and working entirely with non-figurative or abstracted forms. Some artists move back and forth between working in abstract and representational modes, even in the same painting, and this process fascinates us. In varied and highly individualized ways, each artist in the show employs technologies of mark making and gesture, and each engages in strategies of repetition and other methods of compositional structuring. Taken as a whole, the paintings in the exhibition reflect the depth and innovation of each artist's distinct practice. Returning to our title, Marvels of My Own Inventiveness, we take Hortense Spiller's concept of inventiveness as a metaphor for the creative process. That is, the bringing into being of what did not exist before. To put this theory into practice, we created a variety of ways for visitors to interact with the artworks. I like to think about how when we are in close proximity to a work of art, we occupy, if only for a moment, the same space that the maker occupied during the process of the work's creation. In addition to in-depth visual exploration while sharing space with the artworks, we offer an audio guide, a series of curatorial notes and questions, a musical recording, and direct quotes from the artists themselves. Ultimately, we have sought to create a space for immersive looking, sensory exploration, and contemplation. For, in the words of exhibition artist Claude Lawrence, when you're in front of a canvas, it's your turn. Now we'll delve into some details about how our curatorial process unfolded as we chose which artists and artworks to include in the exhibition.
This work, The Man Rode Past His Barn to Another New Day by Thornton Dial, sparked the idea for this whole show. So seeing this work in storage, Brooke and I were both really overcome by the formal qualities of the work, those that we felt really signaled the presence of the artist. So this work, as you can see, is lively and expressive, and there is plenty of evidence of the artist's hand. And there's really a physicality to the work, we feel. So we imagined how Dial would have had to stretch and bend to reach the full space of the canvas, or how he used his hands to mold and cut and place each element. Dial's inventiveness is communicated through the building up of surfaces and what we really saw as this tension between the additive process and a sense of excavation. Then also there's the size and scale of this work. As you can see from the dimensions, it's pretty big. It's 7 feet by 10 feet. And it definitely influenced our decision to have fewer works and fewer artists so that we could highlight bigness and let our artists take up space. Though Dial didn't actually end up in the show, this work was a great source of inspiration for us. Though, through looking at and processing the basic elements of art in this work, the line, the texture, the shape, and the space, we came up with a show that was focused on this formal ingenuity of Black self-taught artists in AFAM's collection. So I want to spend the next few slides talking about how we were able to narrow down our list of artists, because we definitely have more than 5 Black self-taught artists represented in the collection. So we'll talk first about the first decision, which was that we wanted to focus on painting. So it's tempting with a collection that's as vast and varied as AFAM's to want to display a wide range of media. But we felt that offering just one in this case would level the playing field, really allowing for observations and discussions about how different that artists can be while working in the same substance. While paint is a grounding medium, the artists are working on canvas and paper and wood and metal. So artistic individuality is showcased through what we see in paint, but also in the diversity of materials used in this gallery. And as I mentioned before, we were quite taken with the movement that we identified in the works of these painters. Everywhere we noticed gestures that were both big and small. Brooke and I often found ourselves using our own hands, as I had asked you all to do earlier, to mimic the gestures that we noticed, imagining what it would be like if we were making those marks. We picked artworks where we could see the artist hand, where we were hoping that close looking would make a viewer feel that they were working with or observing the artist through the visual indicators of physical action.
Experimentation in the realm of abstraction is a core element that we focus on in this show. These two artworks exemplify the process of moving between abstract and figural modes that we mentioned before. With Marvels, we are interested in exploring forms of expression that aren't always tied directly to an obvious narrative or story, and where a lot of the action is taking place at the level of color, form, or line. Mary T. Smith's work, seen here on the left, exemplifies for us this idea of starting with a representational form, here a human figure, and moving towards abstraction, breaking it down into core elements of line, using repetitive mark making to convey detail, and employing a bold physicality in each painted gesture. Smith describes a figure in space, and also does much more, as we will discuss further a bit later. In the painting on the right, Leonard Daley moves deftly between abstract shapes and recognizable imagery. In particular, he defines forms and situates them in space through a process of relating each shape to the others around it. Daley works with line, especially outline, and plays with positive and negative space. That is, he makes the most out of the way our eyes register forms, like the solid black human-like shapes on the left, and the spaces around those forms, between their legs and arms, for example. Sometimes the spaces between us say more, better define us and our relationships with others than the images we project. It was important to us to include artists who worked or work in diverse geographic areas. Claude Lawrence, for example, grew up in Chicago and has spent much of his adult life in New York. Now he lives and works between Sag Harbor, Long Island, and France, where he also has a house and studio. Purvis Young, meanwhile, lived and worked in South Florida, in Miami's Overtown neighborhood. Mary T. Smith was based in Mississippi, and J.B. Murray in the state of Georgia, while Leonard Daley lived and worked west of Kingston in Jamaica. A major exhibition at the National Gallery in Washington last year was called to create Black Artists of the American South, which featured work by Black self-taught artists framed through a regional lens. And we'll put a link to this exhibition in the chat. With Marvels, we wanted to take a different approach from this regional frame to present the artworks as representative of each artist's unique studio practice and making process.
Focusing on the art, as we've said now, has really guided our design and interpretation decisions. For example, we tried to give each artist their own sections. This is evident, as you can see here, with Mary T. Smith and also Claude Lawrence, which we showed an installation shot of earlier, as they exist alone on one stretch of wall. And then J.B. Murray, which you saw earlier toward the introduction, also has a case. And then we grouped and separated Leonard Daley and Purvis Young along the longest wall in the gallery. This structure is meant to bring attention to each individual artist's practice, while also inviting visitors to make connections between the different works that they see in different sections. Mary T. Smith's works take up the most real estate in the gallery. So as you can see here, we have 7 works on view, which represents AFAM's entire holdings of Mary T. Smith. We felt it important to increase Smith's visibility, as she's the only woman in the show. So in addition to having more works than any other artist on view, she is also prominently displayed as the first artist you see when walking in and working clockwise, starting with the introductory text. And in thinking about what kind of environment that we wanted to create, we looked to the Rothko Chapel for inspiration. We wanted dark wall colors to create a quiet, moody, and cozy feel. We also insisted on benches so that people would be encouraged to really get comfortable and spend time with the artwork. Our goal was really to produce this meditative and contemplative space for close looking and deep reflection.
In a twist on conventional curatorial practices, rather than write about artists or take on a role where we were speaking on an artist's behalf, we tried to address the artists directly as much as possible. In one example on the left, you can see a question that we posed to the artist Claude Lawrence in reference to this specific painting by him. We say, "Dear Claude Lawrence, why so blue?" With gratitude, as always, Sadé, Ayorinde, and Brooke, Wyatt. As you can see, we often opted for short, minimal texts to leave room for interpretation on the part of visitors and to allow our questions to serve as guides or prompts rather than definitive or authoritative commentary. We also included direct quotes from artists talking about their own work, like this one from Purvis Young on the right, offering some insights into the imagery of eyes and eyeballs that regularly appear across his entire body of work, including the work seen here on the right that is included in Marvel's. Young stated, "The eye is the establishment, the blue eye." In addition to the visual and physical experience of sharing space with the artists and their work, we wanted to offer some auditory, sensory experiences as well. We invited contemporary self-taught artist Kevin Hickes, pictured at the left, to spend time studying a selection of works from the show in person at our collection storage facility in Queens. We then had a conversation with Kevin where he shared his responses to the artworks, and from that recording, we developed an audio guide that is now accessible in the Bloomberg Connect app, and we'll put a link to the audio guide in the chat, and you can access it from wherever you are, as well as, of course, if you're in the actual gallery space. And we'll also put a link to Kevin's website in the chat, and I encourage you all to visit and check out his paintings, which are incredible. Sadé and I are both huge fans of his work. So regarding Claude Lawrence, who is pictured on the right, we recorded an oral history interview with Claude, and an excerpt of our interview is available on the audio guide. In addition to being a prolific painter, Claude is an accomplished jazz musician. He was generous enough to share one of his original compositions that he recorded on saxophone last June. And this recording is playing in the gallery space in Claude's section. And it is also available on the audio guide.
So in this last part of the presentation, we'd like to walk you through each different artist and discuss a particular aspect of their art making that stood out to us as inventive. Starting with Mary T. Smith, we noticed that in many of her paintings, she likes to divide the picture plane into compartments that show up often as rectangles. And though we found the effect quite striking, it also brought up a lot of questions for us. So what work do these lines or sections do? Are they structuring elements? How are the figures situated in the space of these sections? And what effect does that have? Are the figures contained or constrained, as in limited, or are they framed and given prominence? Or do they exceed the boundaries, or all three at the same time? So in this work, for example, at first glance, I was drawn to the middle figure and thought that the neon green section was meant to highlight that figure as the most important. That really bright color and the figural definition made it stand out to me. But then I started really wondering about the figures on either side. Are they separated because they're each a different figure, or are they all versions of the same figure? Like perhaps the compartments mark the stages of life, or could they represent the different versions of ourselves that we present in different situations? Whatever the case, the sectioning at play in Mary T. Smith's work is a unique and very intriguing formal quality to explore, and a generative one, I think, as well. With Claude Lawrence, we were captivated by his very expressive gesturing. So Brooke and I are both extremely fond of this work. It was a joy to discover in the collection, and it's awesome to stand in front of. So knowing that Claude was playing music in the studio while making this work, it's fun to explore the big expressive gestures and think about what he was hearing, or to come up with sounds that in your own head that match the movements that your eye is making. When I approach this work, my eye usually goes to the larger patches of white and red as I imagine Lawrence sort of swiping up and down dramatically with his paintbrush. Then I take in the thin black lines and I picture these smaller, maybe more careful hand movements that might be more in the wrist than in the shoulder, like the wider, heavier marks. When we spoke to him about this work, he explained that it was a mood, that sometimes you feel a little melancholy or anxiety. Can we read Claude's mood through how the paint seems to move? Is the improvisational feel, the quick change of directions, and the size and shape of his lines a way of combating a lingering, pensive state of the blues? Or can we read anxiety, say, in the parts where the line is a tighter squiggle or swirl, maybe mimicking the unsettled brain? Nothing, of course, is certain, but reading this work and others by Lawrence as an extension of his body and mind opens up fascinating possibilities for interpretation and personal reflection.
Looking at works like this one by J.B. Murray, we found that the evidence of Murray's gestural mark making really stood out for us. Murray's works operate like maps or documents charting his mark making, like records of the physical movements he enacted to make these marks. If we look at a detail of this work, take a moment to look and notice if you see different types or styles of mark at play, to consider what effect they have. I think someone put in the chat a question about that they were wondering what kind of brushes or what kind of objects or materials Murray might have used to apply the paint to the paper. And I know Sadé and I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about how certain marks by J.B. Murray are more brushy, while others are more solid. Some are fluid, while others are more staccato. Going back to the work as a whole, think about the relationship between Murray's mark making and the other elements of his work, such as color, line, and composition. Notice how he fills all the available space on the page. Murray's mark making tells a story. What do these marks evoke for you? That is, what narratives do you pick up on from Murray's gestural mark making? Now let's return to Leonard Daley and the way he moves between abstraction and figuration. This work contains representational, recognizable elements. The more you look at it, I think the more they start to emerge. Some might strike you right away. There's figures, there's something that looks quite like a face, a human face. And then there are also these abstract shapes and areas of expressive painterly marks and drips. So here there is a complex story being told through color, form, line, and especially outline, as I mentioned before. Let's look at a detail. And looking closely, what do you notice in terms of shape, color, brushwork? What else do you notice in terms of outline? You can see that there are some areas of the canvas that Murray allows to show through. He hasn't painted over every single inch. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm kind of circling one area where I think we're seeing raw canvas peeking through. And I really love thinking about every single aspect of a work of art that we can observe as being the result of a decision, an intentional decision on the artist's part to keep something that way, to allow that bit of canvas to show through and allow the texture in that part of the composition to operate very differently from just a few inches to the right or left. Let's go back to the And there's a lot of tension in this painting, and some of it has to do with scale, how Daley puts large forms into conversation with small details. What do you see going on with scale in this painting? Some of the tension is also generated from that play between abstraction and representation. In the lower part of the canvas, two figures are engaged in some sort of an exchange against a backdrop of patterned marks and drips, which create an abstract shape where the figurative action plays out. I also just want to talk, because I'm always drawn to this, but exploring the way that artists interact with the edges of the surface if they're working two-dimensionally. So here there's a tension between the paint Daley applies and the edges of the canvas, which are not perfectly straight, as you can see, they're pretty irregular. And Daley's made a very particular treatment of the corners. Decisions, again, not to paint all the way, not to totally cover the surface, but to allow the undersurface to show through. And a similar consciousness and intentionality, I think we can read in the relationship between the edge of the central form or conglomeration of forms and the black negative space that surrounds it. Okay. Let's conclude with Purvis Young. I'm just going to talk about repetition here. Across Young's work, imagery repeats and is found again and again, and individual brush strokes and marks repeat over and over again. I was watching a video of Young working and seeing how he was using a paintbrush and doing, making a gesture where he's creating these squiggly brush strokes in black paint over and over again. And as they build up, the presence of so many marks, sometimes overlapping, sometimes separate, starts to generate a sense of crowd scenes. Each individual mark becomes a person, and then all of a sudden there's this teeming mass of people. How do you see repetition at work in this painting? I was thinking about how the repetitive marks that Young uses are also a storytelling technique. By moving into this semi-abstract zone, where imagery is created by the buildup of these repetitive, individually more abstract marks, he kind of moves into a space of powerful allegory, and where the imagery that also repeats again and again becomes more archetypal, so that he, I think of it as creating more room for him to communicate his messages through line, through color, through mark making. We can also notice the structural repetition as Young puts together multiple different panels to create the size and shape of the overall painting that he's after. And I think that the quote that we read from Young about eyeball imagery in his work, where he talked about the eye as the establishment, and in these crowd scenes and in other imagery that appears again and again, Young is absolutely making social and political commentaries, which he spoke about. And just going back to the kind of anchoring idea that guided our work on this show, our approach was not to avoid or ignore by any means any kind of content that was present in the works, but rather to get there through a process of looking closely. So to get to a place where we can start to notice the details of Young's imagery and can grapple with what meaning are brought by the repetition of this imagery again and again, and what is communicated through the way he worked. So it's sort of a different way, rather than starting with the content, let's say, or starting with the story and then going to how it was executed. We wanted to start with the execution. Okay. Oh, I see some.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I think it was really great to have you both to walk through the space with you too. I think your presentation was really reflective, or reflect very well the visitor's experience in the space. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing all these details, and for this wonderful exhibition. I don't see any question in the chat, but please share any comments, anything you would like to should like our speakers to respond. If you noticed anything and that you would like to expand on, please share any thoughts. As we wait for more questions from our audience, I will ask questions to you both. And maybe we can talk about the letter you wrote to JB Murray in the beginning of your presentation, Brooke, and this letter that you wrote together, in which you say that you enjoy being surrounded by his work. And I felt like more than an invitation to contemplate your exhibition encourages also to enjoy this time with the work on view, to take our time to look at it, and to really take time, but also to have pleasure in this act of looking. And so I was wondering why so much focus on the pleasure of looking. Why is it important for you both in this context of this research, and how does it contribute to our understanding of the paintings?
Do you want to start, Brooke, or do you want me to?
Maybe I'll just quickly say that I'm pausing a little bit thinking about pleasure, because as an idea, I certainly enjoyed all of the time we spent, especially when we were looking at the artworks in person, and then now getting to be in the space. I do feel kind of a sense of serenity, and also like something powerful, something tangible that, is maybe akin to some kind of joy. But I know that I was also so focused on thinking about, how can we approach a show like this where we're trying not to speak for the artists, in terms of the idea that the artists have already spoken, they've already done the work and created these objects. So it's on us now to kind of be open to responding to the questions that the artists have already posed, in a way. And that, I don't know, it's maybe not so separate of a process from the pleasure of looking. But that's what came to my mind right away.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I don't think that we went into this thinking about pleasure, but I like that. I like that on the back end, that's what comes out of it, in terms of, yeah, I think the way we experienced, especially being able to look at these works come together, as opposed to just sort of seeing them separately during the sort of as we were gathering them together and thinking about them. But I think if that's the way that are talking about and presenting this is like interpreted, is that there was pleasure there, then I think that's actually really fantastic. But I guess my answer is like a little bit maybe more simple, in that, you go to museums all the time, and there's just a lot to read, there's a lot to take in. And museums often, not always at all, but often have labels that go with every single work, and then you have the section texts that you have to read. And in particular, this show is shown at the museum along with, as you mentioned earlier, Mathilde, in your introduction, a show called Unnamed Figures, that is this really deep sort of historical show that is heavy in writing. There's lots and lots to read. There's a lot of historical data to sort of sift through. And for us, what Marvel's turned out to be is like a little bit of like a reprieve from that, a chance to just sort of return to this very basic like looking and like just and being able and being allowed to not be always thinking about what something means, but just being able to make observations. And I think that was like really important for Brooke and I, that sometimes it's nice not to have to do a lot of reading, and not to have to do a lot of interpretive work. If you can just simply catch on to a line or a color or a gesture that you think is interesting or that makes you feel something, like sometimes that can be lost in spaces where you have to do a lot of other intellectual work to get through. So I think we just wanted to bring it back to just the space of looking and thinking about basic elements of art.
Thank you, Sadé, for making also the comparison with a name figure, because I think, yes, it's definitely also experienced in this context, and Marvel's definitely feels like a breathing room, like a place where we can also process what we went through. A name figure, I don't know, there is this really a really interesting dynamic between the two shows, and you participated in the two shows, so it was great to hear you also talk about how they respond to each other. And I think it goes also with one question from our audience, who's also an educator and a docent at the museum, for Melissa Ram. Melissa says it's refreshing and freeing as an educator docent to explore the works in this way, rather than rely so much on biography. Is this show you as curators would prefer we discuss these works with our visitors?
I have a thought, which is that kind of like what I was saying, talking about Purvis Young, and that I think I found with being in the space and talking with people and looking together, that you can go towards any destination that you have in mind by starting with the work, which turns out to be interesting. And it turns out that this close looking and contemplative study and just being with the paintings doesn't mean that you can't also discern and start to and learn about the artist's making process. So, for example, a visitor was looking at Mary T. Smith's work and noticed that in a painting on a piece of corrugated metal, they could see nail holes, or where the work had been hung on the wall at one time. And then that led us into a conversation about how there's photo documentation of Mary T. Smith's yard around her home with a fence, and with many of her works nailed onto the fence by her. So we were seeing evidence not only of her making process, but then also a way that she installed the works herself during her lifetime. But we got there by noticing these close details on the work itself. And I think that that's an interesting exercise to try with all of the artists' work, is like, how can we kind of be like detectives and retracing their steps and looking for clues to how and why they made these works the way they did.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really beautiful example. I don't think I have like a ton more to add. I think Brooke's example really says it all, that sure, these are not, a lot of these artists are not unknown to people, especially if they're, if they enjoy self-taught art. And so there probably is a background based on other things you've read or other things that you've seen in other institutions, or even ways that we've displayed them here at the Folk Art Museum before for the ones that we have. But we purposefully didn't include any of that information because we wanted people to start with the work. So I would say that yes, we would prefer that wherever the conversation takes you in the gallery, that it's from something that you can point to in the work and say, I saw this, and then now it leads me to something else. Definitely.
But it's also very refreshing to think you as curators that you also really focus on emotions or on response or like looking. I think this is really amazing to see like both, both, way of thinking about art, just research, really intellectually research work, and then also just the pleasure of looking at we were discussing earlier. So both are part of the work of a curator, and I think that's great to also highlight these two parts of your research and of your work as curators. We have now many questions, so I'm going to share them with you. So we have one question from Rebecca, two questions. So she would like, or they would like to hear more of your text questions to the artist. If you have any more thing that you ask to the artist, you would like to share. And also, how many of the artists in the show feel their work is spiritual?
Let's see. So I guess I'll take the first question, or start with the first question, saying that a lot of the questions that we were bringing up in the actual presentation were questions that we asked as we were developing the show. As far as what's in the show, I feel like we made some other observations. There's one Mary T. Smith work that we don't have like a single image of, but it's a work. Can you go back, Brooke, to the Mary T. Smith
Wall?
Yeah. It's a work that has what we've identified as like some animal looking creatures. It's that orange, kind of in yellow and red looking one that Brooke is trying to signal with the cursor. So we didn't, we made these observations about numbers and how numbers seem to come up in Mary T. Smith's work. I mean, as you can see, even here, there's 1, 2, 3 figures in the blue, and then in the green that I spoke of, and then the animals seem to be stacked on top of each other in 2 sections of the work. So we made this observation about numbers at play, and we're asking some questions about why are numbers important to you? Is this like a way that you have like talked about your life in other ways, or is it just related to your work? So we were asking questions there, and in the Mary T. Smith that's next to the intro text, this sort of tall one at the far left, there seems to be the word here written atop, like right across, like maybe the top of the figure's head. And it looks like it's, yeah, HEAR is what it appears to be. And so we were wondering, is that, are you telling us to hear something, or is that like a play on words? Are you saying that you are here, like you're in this place? And so we asked questions of Mary T. Smith regarding that. I don't think we asked Claude Lawrence any other questions except for about the color blue in the work that we mentioned in the presentation. And however, Kevin Hickes, our artist that we used for the audio guide, we asked him several questions as sort of prompts to think about what he was seeing at play in the works. And then, Brooke, I don't think there were other questions. I mean, you read a whole bunch with the J.B. Murray. Purvis Young, we more used quotes. And then Leonard Daley, you did sort of just a formal analysis, or like a formal reading. I think those were all the questions. Did I forget any?
Yeah, I think you've covered all the questions that made it into the final, version of text that went up on the wall. But this show is just one question after another. I wanted to share that while we were installing the show, one of the art handlers that worked on the install read the letter that we wrote to JB Murray that we read earlier. And then he said, "Do you answer the questions that you ask here someplace else?" like you answer these questions somewhere, right? Nope. That's the whole idea of this questioning process is to kind of recognize like our own kind of positionality in relation to these works and to these artists. You know, like we're not the ones who are the experts on these artists or on their work. It's the artists themselves. And I might respond to the other question from Rebecca about how many of the artists in the show feel that their work is spiritual. And I'm fascinated by this question, and I kind of want to return the question to you in a way, Rebecca, and everyone, just to say, I'm so curious I wonder if you felt this presence of something spiritual in some of these works, and if that's maybe where your question was coming from. And I think if, you know, just I'm not trying to be coy by not just answering directly. But part of the reason why we wrote that letter to JB Murray asking him if his work was a source of protection, or did he think about it as artwork, or maybe it was lots of things at once, had to do with the fact that the ways that we conventionally define what art is, what kinds of art should go into a museum or be appreciated in terms of their color and their line and their formal qualities, like we do in marbles. We just wanted to open up a lot of those criteria that are often pretty limiting about what kinds of work should be shown, or that artwork has to be made for, you know, with an art world conversation in mind, or something like that. And with JB Murray in particular, I think we thought a lot about how there's a tension between what is visible and what is obscured, with all of the layers that he uses and the way he builds up the surface over time. I think somebody noted in the chat that they could see some evidence of a script, looked like writing. And again, this tension between JB Murray shows some aspects of his practice and made known some of, you know, by speaking about his work. And then other aspects are perhaps not intentionally not so readily available. And it was in those moments of tension that I think we wanted to be careful not to step in our role as curators, not to step in and, you know, make a definitive statement one way or another, when it might be more interesting to sit with the uncertainty a bit.
We have another question from Suzanne. Are the first objects in the glass case there because of close looking or conservation? So it's more a question for display design.
So definitely, I mean, for close looking, because everything we wanted to try to make, you know, for close looking. And I guess for conservation as well. But I guess what I wanted to say about, like, to follow up on what Brooke was saying in her last statement, was that there are a number of things, number of questions that that we ask, or things that could be informed by biographical information, or by research, or by comments that the artists have made that were recorded, that we brought into the space, but we wrote it as a question because by asking a question about like, oh, was this supposed to be something to protect you or something, it could trigger observations from the audience that maybe you wouldn't have triggered if you weren't thinking about that as even a possibility, right? So instead of just offering that information that like, here's something that we feel like we think we know or have been told about JB Murray, we asked it as a question to trigger different ways of seeing, right? So in this particular instance, the putting JB Murray in the case is also based on questions that we had about his artistic practice. If in fact we wondered, he thought of his works as artworks. Like, were they supposed to be artworks? In fact, all of those JB Murrays in the case were framed, and we decided to have them taken out of the frame, just to align with this question that we don't know. If he didn't, in fact, picture them or think of them as artworks, then maybe he never would have imagined them being framed. Maybe they were supposed to serve in a different way for him. And so maybe they were visual objects for like his consumption or for other people's consumption, but maybe he didn't necessarily locate them at the level of framing that happens in an art museum. So we took them out of the frame to give them a different touch than some of the rest of the works in the gallery that were going to be hung on the wall, but also just to address the possibility that maybe they were something else, which could again stir questions in the viewers or ways of reading in the viewers that might be different if you were just told JB Murray didn't think of these as art, or he did think of these as art, or if we displayed them like we thought they were art, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, definitely a lot of space for multiplicity and a multiple also forms of interpretation. I don't see any other questions, but maybe to end, I was wondering if we could talk also a bit more about the Kevin Ekes, who was invited by you two, as you said earlier, to respond to the work and share some of his thoughts. And as a way of introducing his comments, he shared a general comment that I would like to say it again here. He said, we need to get used to the idea that Black artists and artists in general we're not always trying to convey our experience of whatever race we are to the world. Sometimes we're just trying to have fun and to create something new. So to go back to this idea of pleasure and having fun, I would love for you to expand a little bit more about this comment from Kevin and this idea also of and I think that is very present in your exhibition, this idea of thinking about of these works made by Black artists, not outside any expectation about racial experience or racial concern.
I have a couple initial thoughts that I'll just share. One is that it was really exciting, I think, to hear Kevin's reflections on the works and what he was picking up on as a painter looking at other paintings by other painters. And with JB Murray's work again, and specifically the work that we did the close looking exercise about at the beginning. Kevin said he uses blue in very specific areas is something that he said about a Claude Lawrence work. And about JB Murray, I believe, this may have just been in a conversation we had at the opening, but he was talking about how JB Murray seemed to be very specific about placing red paint here, but not over here, and blue paint here, but not over here. And Kevin's insight about this, that came at the level of process. Again, they came from one painter looking at the work of another painter. Turns out to, kind of check out, so to speak. Like if you research what's been written about JB Murray and things that he did say about his work, taken with a grain of salt, because this information's been filtered through many different narrators. There is this information out there that Murray ascribed a different forces or ideas to different colors, in the sense that it would make a lot of sense why he wouldn't. He would use red here, but not over here, because these colors have really specific meanings. The fact that Kevin was picking up on that in such a particular way, without having done that research first, so to speak, I think points to a bigger question that I think we both want to raise in this exhibition, which is that rather than having there be this binary between, you have on one side pleasure and experimentation and emotion, and on the other side you have intellectualism and research, but to say, you know, these don't have to be separate as a binary, and certainly to push back against ways that in art history and curatorial practice that works by Black artists have been assigned to a particular location in a given binary like that. We wanted to kind of push through that and say, you know, it's not an intellectual endeavor to look closely and trace an artist's decision-making process as it evolved across time, and to use that as the primary source for your investigation. I think jazz music breaks down this binary between intellect and emotion in an interesting way, and that also, like, moving between abstraction and figuration, kind of once you're in that space of tension between there, you know, kind of what is possible. And I think that's partly how I heard Kevin's reflection, speaking about making work and painting from that place where he is himself making a mark as a human, without, you know, making a mark to locate his work in a particular category because he is a Black artist.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's really well said. And I feel like Brooke and I had so many conversations around this idea and other ideas, both and coming up with the idea for the show and figuring out how we wanted to display everything, and then talking with Kevin. Like, I think that Brooke is speaking for both of us in terms of our ideas with what she just said. So I'm satisfied with that.